Kevin de Bruyne made his return for Manchester City this weekend, coming off the bench against Newcastle to score one and assist one to turn the result around in Manchester City's favour to win 3-2. And since then, there's been some talks of Kevin de Bruyne being considered the greatest Premier League midfielder of all time, or at least since its inception in 1992. And look, I appreciate that people have their own opinions and that people can feel that Kevin de Bruyne is the greatest Premier League midfielder of all time. But I massively disagree with that opinion. I don't think that Kevin de Bruyne is even in the top 10 greatest Premier League midfielders of all time. And I'm going to give some context to that opinion. I'm going to tell you exactly why I think that. Get down in the comment section below and tell me whether you think I'm an idiot or not. I don't really care. But let's give some context to this. Look, Kevin de Bruyne is definitely the best Premier League midfielder today. There's no question about that. There is nobody that I can really think of that even comes close to Kevin de Bruyne. Bernardo Silva is a pretty good shout. He is he's a very good player. He's a very complete player. And he offers lots of different things all over the pitch. Kevin de Bruyne is obviously known for his creativity, his vision, his passing range, etc., etc. I remember when he was brought in by Chelsea I think it was under Jose Mourinho, and people talked about his unbelievable passing ability back then, his creativity. Obviously, I believe he came in from Wolfsburg. Special young talent, and people were really, really excited to see what he could become. Obviously, it didn't work out for him at Chelsea, and he ends up at Manchester City, and his career really takes off from there. Unfortunately for Kevin de Bruyne, he's kind of peaked in the wrong era of football. And I keep having these conversations about sort of the competitive nature of football currently, that previously football across the world, internationally, across Europe, in the Premier League itself, was much more competitive 15 to 20 years ago than it is today. And look, we're going through one of the more competitive seasons in the Premier League that we've seen for probably 5 years now, since Guardiola took charge at Manchester City. It's pretty much been Man City, Liverpool 1-1, Man City, etc., etc. And we're going through this season, probably the most competitive season that we've seen for a long time. And back in sort of the early 2000s, when Gerrard was starting to come towards his prime years, I'd say he sort of peaked in sort of 04, 05 and 05 and 06. I would say that was probably his peak years. But during that period of time, sort of around the early to mid 2000s, some of the sort of lesser teams in the Premier League had some really, really talented players in them. And I'm going to take you through some of the players that Bolton Wanderers had in the 2002-2003 season. They had Bernard Mendy, who was a French international defender. They had Ivan Campo, who was a Spanish defender who won the Champions League with Real Madrid the previous season. Henrik Pedersen, who was a talented midfielder. JJ Okocha, who was an unbelievably special wide midfielder / winger. Kind of similar to Ronaldinho with regard to his dribbling abilities and his on-ball abilities and his ball control. Obviously not as talented as Ronaldinho, but definitely in that sort of mould. Jonathan Walters, who was a serviceable player, hard-working sort of player. Yuri Djorkaeff, who was a midfielder who won the World Cup with France. I believe he was in their starting 11 for the final. Kevin Nolan, another hard-working player. Jussi Jääskeläinen, a very underrated goalkeeper. Back then in the early 2000s, like really good goalkeepers were just everywhere in the Premier League. Every team had one. And so there's sort of 8 players that played for Bolton in 02-03. And what I want you to do is I want you to get into the comment section and guess where you think that they finished in that season. I'll give you a few seconds to do that. But for reference, where Bolton finished back then is where Everton are currently. And Everton don't have any special players at all. They don't have anybody that really stands out. Whereas the Bolton team from 02-03, who finished 17th, they had 3 players who I think really stood out. One was Ivan Campo, the centre-back who won the Champions League with Real Madrid, JJ Okocha, and Yuri Djorkaeff. And look, this is the level that the Premier League was competing at back then. Those 3 players were in a team that finished 17th in the league that year. And those 3 players, they walk into the starting 11 of Aston Villa, Tottenham, Manchester United, Chelsea, and practically every team in the Premier League except for Arsenal, Liverpool, and Manchester City. They walk into those starting 11s. They were really, really good players, and they played for Bolton, who finished 17th. If those 3 players could walk into any team in the Premier League barring those top 3 teams, and they finished 17th, that should give you perspective about just how competitive the Premier League is now compared to back then. If we consider that 3 players could walk into the 4th best team in the league now, then what that means is that the level of competition that Kevin de Bruyne is playing against is significantly less than the competition that a Steven Gerrard played against, or a Frank Lampard, or a Roy Keane, or Paul Scholes, or Vieira, or even a Yaya Toure. Kevin de Bruyne over the previous 5 years when he has hit his prime and peaked, hasn't been playing against the teams that sort of, when we look back and we would make these lists sort of without considering Kevin de Bruyne, a lot of these players would be number 1 or number 2, number 3. Some people might have Roy Keane as number 1, or Gerrard, or Vieira, even Makelele. Those players played against much better teams. Those players played against much better players. And not only that, but people praise Kevin de Bruyne for obviously his creativity, his vision, his passing ability. And yes, he has that in spades. But the top players of 15 or 20 years ago, that was kind of expected of them. The top midfielders. It was expected that Gerrard could pick out a pass. We've seen it so many times, a 30-yard pass from Steven Gerrard that nobody else sees. Beckham was another one who was unbelievably good at that, just picking out a pass and playing it perfectly. Scholes was brilliant at that. Roy Keane was very good at the very simple passes, quick passes into feet, get them going on the turn, stuff like that. Patrick Vieira, known for his fluidity and his physicality. Right? These players, they were expected to do the things, all of the things that Kevin de Bruyne does very, very well. And they were expected to do those things as well as Kevin de Bruyne does them. Not only that, though, they were expected to do things going in the opposite direction. They were expected to go forwards. They were expected to come backwards too. This is where I think that people of the past they get punished for being much more complete players than a Kevin de Bruyne is expected to be today. Because a Steven Gerrard was expected to provide, let's say, 20 assists a season like Kevin de Bruyne, but also expected that he'll make 20 key tackles per season or more, 50, right? These players were known for being absolute monsters on the field, right? And not just in terms of being an athlete, being able to track constantly being on the move, but also making these last-ditch tackles, being a physical presence on the pitch. Roy Keane says all the time that he would stick one on them early so that they knew that he was there. That they were tasked with being the wall in front of the defence, particularly the central midfielders, which is something which a player like Kevin de Bruyne is not necessarily expected. It's not necessarily expected that he goes in on a sliding tackle against a top player to make a statement early on in the game. Get in on, let's say, Salah. Get in on Salah early. Let him know you're there. Dominating players, not just with regard to the passing and the creativity, but dominating them physically, preventing the other team from having a game. Steven Gerrard and Roy Keane and Paul Scholes, and even Lampard, who was very well known for, history has sort of changed the narrative on Frank Lampard as if he was just a goal-scoring midfielder. He was not just a goal-scoring midfielder. That guy threw in tackles just like Gerrard did, on a similar regularity, on a similar frequency, and just as hard and just as physical as a Gerrard or a Keane or any of the other players who are known for being that type of player. Yaya Toure was another one. Claude Makelele, Kante later on. Less sort of physical but more sort of hard-working Kante was. These players were much more complete players than Kevin de Bruyne. And so if we're going to make arguments for Kevin de Bruyne being the best Premier League midfielder of all time, we have to take into context other aspects of previous players' games. Another aspect that we have to consider is the leadership qualities of a Roy Keane, of a Steven Gerrard. If you've ever watched the 2005 Champions League final, if you've ever watched the 2006 FA Cup final, those were Gerrard's games. Those were games, for example, in that Champions League final, Liverpool were literally playing against the best team in Europe, right? The list of players in that team, let's go through it, because I remember them. We're talking about Dida in goal, one of the best goalkeepers in the world at that time. At right back, Cafu. At centre back, we had Jaap Stam and Alejandro Nesta. And then at left back was Paolo Maldini. You're talking about probably the best back four that history has ever seen in club competition. Probably. In midfield, I believe they played a diamond with Pirlo and Gattuso and Seedorf and Kaka. And then a front two of Andrei Shevchenko and Crespo. Look at the Liverpool team in comparison. They had nothing in comparison. They played Milan Baros up front for the last 20 minutes they played him. Or maybe he came on at half time, I'm not sure. Milan Baros. And Gerrard pretty much single-handedly, along with Xabi Alonso next to him, in the second half, being 3-0 down, And I remember that game. I was a teenager when that was being played, and I watched it live. I watched it live. It was played in Istanbul. It was one of the greatest football games that I've ever seen in my life. At halftime, Rafa Benitez makes the change, drops Gerrard back into more of a central role next to Xabi Alonso, and the two of them dominated midfield. Dominated midfield. Gerrard, man, he was a leader on that pitch. He turned that game around. He was an incredible figure in that game. He was unstoppable. He was everywhere on that pitch. And you're going to tell me about Kevin de Bruyne? Get real. Get real. It's not true. It's not correct. It's not correct. Steven Gerrard was a man. He was a giant human being on the pitch. 7 foot tall, 300 pounds, with the stamina of a wolf, could run for miles. Unbelievable player. Technical ability, strength, endurance, leadership. Unreal player. And look, I'm not gonna bitch and moan about young people not having a perspective on football with regard to these older players, because the reality is that around 97, that was when football in my mind started. That everything that kind of came before that was irrelevant, and it took me until I was in my 20s to start to appreciate certain players like a Marco van Basten or a Glenn Hoddle, those kinds of players who were generations before I came along and started watching football, you know. Even a George Weah, by the time I was interested in football, George Weah was mostly finished. So I'm not going to lambast kids for talking about Kevin de Bruyne as the greatest Premier League midfielder of all time, but I just want to give some perspective to that. That stop looking at the clips, because they don't help you. They don't tell you what kind of player that Gerrard was, that Keane was, or Lampard. There's these perspectives based on, well, that was kind of the best element of their game, so we'll put together an edit of him doing those things. But it doesn't show you that a lot of midfielders, even a Yuri Djorkaeff, playing in that Bolton team, was a very, very complete midfielder, which is something that Kevin de Bruyne is not, because he doesn't have to be anymore, because football's moved on, because Kevin de Bruyne can be sort of a bit more of a free role. He can have the creativity without necessarily having to be a defensive rock like Gerrard and Keane and Lampard and others were. So Kevin de Bruyne, for me, not the greatest Premier League midfielder of all time. The best midfielder of the Premier League today, for sure. Probably in the top 3 midfielders in the world. I think that's a reasonable opinion to have. But not the greatest of all time. Let me know what you think in the comment section down below. Is Kevin de Bruyne the greatest midfielder of all time in the Premier League? Or is it Gerrard or Keane or one of the others? Let me know what you think down below. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe, and have a great day.